Today, we will discuss some of the flaws of the Bantu paradigm and why Bantu as a concept should be thrown in the dustbin of history. Bantu is a relic of colonial ethnography. To begin, we must start with the German-born South African linguist Wilhelm Bleek, who is the inventor of Bantu in linguistics. The technical term Bantu was first coined by Bleek from the Zulu word Abantu, meaning people. Bleek was one of many colonial ethnographers who sought to categorize African people for European powers, so that they could be easy to manage and control. Wilhelm Bleek's legacy in South Africa extends beyond his contributions to linguistics. It also encompasses his role in perpetuating a racial hierarchy system that significantly impacted education. Bleek's work, particularly his publication of Renard the Fox in South Africa or Hottentot Fables and Tales in 1864, marked a pivotal moment in South African literary history, reflecting a Victorian interpretation of African cultural narratives. His editorial approach, aimed at civilizing indigenous orature, inadvertently contributed to the cultural politics that stifled indigenous expression and shaped South Africa's literary landscape. Bleek's theories of language and race influenced his censorship of indigenous narratives, erasing their original essence and confining Quenya imagination within European folktale conventions. This suppression of indigenous voices resonated in the education system, notably with the establishment of the Bantu Education Act in 1953 under Apartheid. The act centralized control of African education, relegating it to a separate and inferior status under the Bantu Education Department. The racial hierarchy perpetuated by Bleek's views on language and culture was institutionalized, leading to unequal access to education and resources for Black, colored, and Indian communities. This segregation extended to tertiary education with the extension of University Education Act of 1959, which barred Black students from attending white universities and established segregated tribal colleges. Bleek's influence on cultural representations and his role in shaping colonial narratives underscored the complexities of colonial ethnography, influencing policies that marginalized non-white communities and perpetuated racial inequalities in education. The legacy of Bleek's interventions in South African literature and education serves as a reminder of the enduring impact of colonial ideologies on societal structures and the ongoing struggle for educational equity in post-apartheid South Africa. When it comes to historical linguistics, Bantu has numerous flaws. Dr. S. Wangara Ngalanjam asserts that the notion that language, culture, and race are directly correlated does not stand up to scrutiny. This is evident when considering the example of the Beer language, spoken by both farming and trapping communities in the forest of northeastern Zaire, and by pygmy hunters who have close interactions with them, or neighboring crop growers. Despite speaking the same language, these groups belong to different ethnic backgrounds. Furthermore, the Bira farmers residing in the savannah have distinct lifestyles from their forest-dwelling counterparts who also speak the Bira language. This demonstrates that a single language may not be tied to a singular culture. Conversely, various cultures and ways of life can be observed among people who speak different languages and live in communities adjacent to those mentioned. For instance, the forest-dwelling Bira share similarities in lifestyle with the Walis, who speak a Central Sudanic language, while Pygmies exhibit comparable lifestyles to neighboring Pygmy hunters who speak Sudanic languages. Additionally, stock breeders, regardless of whether they speak Central Sudanic, Bantu, or Nilotic languages, share similar lifestyles. Thus, the strict correspondence between language and culture is not evident. When it comes to the history of Bantu linguistic classification in the mid-19th century, the genetic relationship between Bantu and West African languages was acknowledged by several researchers. According to Karl Meinhof, Bantu was produced by an Egyptian father and Negritic mother. Reverend John Layton Wilson called the inhabitants of Africa south of the fifth parallel, north members of the great Ethiopian Nilotic family, and distinct from those whom he identified as Negritians, who lived north of this point. To Wilson, those identified as Bantu today are the descendants of the great ancient nations of the Nile in Khat and Kush. During the first half of the 20th century, scholars often treated Bantu as a separate language family from West African languages based on typological grounds, a tradition influenced by paleontology and biology. Despite Proto-West Sudanic and Proto-Bantu's resemblances in basic vocabulary and noun class structure, Westermann initially excluded Bantu from the West Sudanic group in 1927, although he later recognized their genetic relationship. Greenberg's contribution lay in situating Bantu within West Sudanic, renaming the group Niger-Congo. Utilizing evidence from Westermann, Greenberg highlighted resemblances between Proto-West Sudanic and Proto-Bantu in vocabulary and noun class affixes, supporting their inclusion. Greenberg rejected a borrowing hypothesis proposed by Guthrie, citing tonal system agreements and dubious explanations for certain borrowings. He argued that fundamental vocabulary tends to be least subject to borrowing, with some words widely found in West Sudanic but not in Bantu, suggesting shared innovations unique to Bantu. Greenberg's distinction between wide Bantu and narrow Bantu, the latter essentially Guthrie's Bantu, sparked further inquiry into their genetic unity. Williamson extended the notion of wide Bantu, aligning it with Southern Bantoid. However, establishing wide Bantu as a genetic unity necessitates further research due to Greenberg's lack of specific examples. The question of narrow Bantu's unity remains under discussion. Recent scholarship has cast doubt on the traditional conception of narrow Bantu as a genetically unified group. Stewart, 1976, highlights a lack of evidence for common shared innovations supporting narrow Bantu's unity, as noted by Guthrie. Heine was among the first to question this unity, citing Boob's greater distance from the rest of narrow Bantu compared to Tivoid and Ekoid. Presentations at the 1977 Conference on Bantu Expansion further suggested the exclusion of additional languages from narrow Bantu, with Heine, 1980b, specifically mentioning several zones for extraction. Bennett and Sturck's 1977 study introduces further skepticism by dividing narrow Bantu into Equatorial Bantu and Zambezi Bantu based on isoglossic evidence, indicating closer relations with other linguistic groups. Additional studies by Bastien, Coupes, and de Hallo, 1983, using lexicostatistics include T-void within narrow Bantu, yet without shared innovation evidence. Despite remaining questions, it's evident that the conventional understanding of narrow Bantu's composition is under scrutiny. Waters, 1989, underscores lingering inquiries about Bantoid internal classification, including both wide and narrow Bantu's integrity. The debate also extends to the origin of Bantu-speaking people, with Greenberg proposing a southeastern Nigeria or western Cameroon origin followed by rapid migration to the east and south. Studies in the early 1970s by Henrici, 1973, Heine, 1973, and Heine, Hoff, and Vossen, 1977, support this notion, suggesting a slow penetration of the equatorial forest region, followed by swift expansion into savanna regions to the east and south. The comparative method is traditionally seen as the most reliable way to establish genetic relationships between languages, involving the comparison of lexical items and grammatical forms, setting up correspondences between phonemes and hypothesizing about proto-languages and sound laws. However, its use in Niger-Congo classification has been overlooked, with only micro-level applications to subgroups like Bantu. there has been no comprehensive effort to establish a proto-system for Niger-Congo as a whole. According to Dixon's punctuated equilibrium model, it is impossible to prove that the nodes within Niger-Congo are genetically related. Manfred K.H. Ehret adds to this by affirming that Bantu languages only came to be written down in dictionaries, grammars, texts, and so forth. In the 19th century, there are no genuine linguistic sources in the narrow historical sense of the term prior to that time. That is to say, Bantu languages are not attested by authentic evidence before the 19th century. That is to say, that even the earliest written Bantu material is all but contemporaneous. With the temporal context, historical Bantu linguists tried to reconstruct. Thus, all Bantu reconstruction is based on the comparative method of historical linguistics, or some derivatives of it, developed in the 19th century. By contrast, a number of Indo-European languages are attested to by original texts, some of which go back to the first half of the second millennium BC. Also, while we are dealing with about 300 to 500 Bantu languages, Indo-European is restricted to about 140 languages, which have been intensely studied since the beginning of the 19th century. Today, Indo-European is considered the most exhaustively analyzed language family on a global scale. The important point to remember here concerns the fact that with regard to Bantu, the comparative method is not capable of furnishing any information on the absolute time depth of the reconstructions achieved by it. As just indicated, these are exclusively based on what one might call a kind of linguistic presence. Consequently, this is also true for all speculative efforts of linking all language detachments or splits in the rainforest and elsewhere to an absolute temporal framework. In general, modern historical linguists do not consider the methods of lexicostatistics and glottochronology used to build Bantu as valid. This means that the underlying linguistic configuration of the Bantu languages within Niger-Congo are fraudulent. Dr. Roger Blench states that Bantu is definitely not a group. This may seem surprising in the light of the published claims to the contrary, but the argument from comparative linguistics, which links the highly diverse languages of Zone A to a genuine reconstruction, is non-existent. Most claimed Proto-Bantu is either confined to particular subgroups or is widely attested outside Bantu proper. Blench also affirms that Bantu is definitely not a group. For Dr. Theophile Obenga, Proto-Bantu should not be used in the scientific process of comparing the pharaonic language with modern African languages because of its flawed configuration and the absence of essential linguistic elements observed across the continent. The Egyptologist Dr. Mubabinge Bilolo continues by stating that Bantu is a white South African pseudonym invented to erase to the historical legacy of the great Ethiopian family described in classical literature. When it comes to archaeology, the task of reconstructing historical processes, theoretically straightforward, presents significant challenges when applied to the study of the Bantu expansion in Africa, especially when compared to the more extensively researched Indo-European languages. Despite the abundance of linguistic and archaeological data in the Indo-European context, specialists still hold divergent theories, highlighting the complexity of such endeavors. One of the key difficulties lies in attributing early Ironegicides to Bantu-speaking communities, as the presence of Iron working does not necessarily imply exclusive Bantu involvement. While there is evidence of rapid pottery spread in East Africa coinciding with the expansion of Eastern Bantu languages, the interpretation of these findings as evidence of the Bantu expansion is not without controversy. Limited excavations in other Bantu-speaking regions further complicate efforts to draw conclusive connections between linguistic and archaeological evidence. Additionally, it is plausible that the rapid spread of iron was facilitated by a minority of skilled artisans rather than the broader population. Importantly, archaeology alone cannot determine the language spoken by ancient peoples, emphasizing the need for careful consideration and comparison of linguistic and archaeological data to gain insights into historical processes. The Bantu paradigm is also totally invalid. According to Dr. S. Luanga Lunyigo, the need to separate linguistic data from archaeological data should again be emphasized. This is necessary in order to avoid the danger of confusing the probative value of different disciplines. And, more important still, to avoid the intellectual danger of creating a myth, a powerful one, but nonetheless unfounded. There is a temptation on hearing the word Bantu to associate it with an ethnic or national reality, whereas it is only a linguistic label. It does not denote a people or a society or a culture. Bleek's choice of a label was somewhat too apt, and we must now defend ourselves against the consequences. For just as the Hamitic myth grew out of the confusion of language, culture, and race, so also a Bantu myth would be sure to develop from a similar confusion. There are still those who attempt to use archaeology and genetics to validate Bantu as a legitimate category. This is illogical because no amount of material culture and genomic data can replace a failure to apply the historical comparative method to Bantu reconstitution. Felix Chami's critique of Christopher Ehret's analysis of the Bantu migration exposes many popular myths about its alleged history. Chami acknowledges Ehret's contribution in challenging the notion of a unified, rapid Bantu expansion across sub-Saharan Africa, but raises significant points of contention regarding Ehret's research. Chami suggests that Ehret's reliance on lexicostatistics to trace the movement of Bantu speakers from the Cameroon-Gabon area through the Congo forest overlooks crucial archaeological evidence that could enrich our understanding of the Bantu expansions. He highlights recent archaeological findings in Cameroon, which indicate domestication, microlithic industry, and iron smelting dating back to 800 to 200 BC, challenging Ehret's timeline for the spread of Bantu culture and technology. Chami questions Ehret's assertion that Bantu speakers borrowed language and cultural elements from Sudanian Eastern Sahelian populations in the Great Lake region after their arrival around 1000 BC. He argues that if these purported Bantu speakers had already acquired iron technology before reaching the Great Lake region, as suggested by archaeological evidence, then the need to borrow such elements from other groups becomes questionable. Furthermore, Chami points out that recent archaeological research along the Tanzanian coast indicates the presence of Late Stone Age, LSA, cultures engaging in domestication and trade with the Mediterranean world as early as 800 BC, challenging the timeline proposed by Ehret for the Bantu expansions. Moreover, Chami critiques Ehret's paradigmatic inclinations, which portray Central and Southern Africans as passive recipients of cultural influences rather than dynamic participants in their own development. He argues against Ehret's characterization of Bantu speakers as inert and lacking in institutions or inclinations for empire building, suggesting that such views limit our understanding of the agency and complexity of ancient African societies. Dr. Felix Chami's analysis of schematic geometric amorphous drawings in the Lake Ukerewe Basin revealed a script that resembles the North African Tifinagh script, which originated from the ancient Kemetic hieroglyphs. This suggests that the people of Central and Southeast Africa had extensive interactions with the ancient civilizations of KMT, Garamante, and Carthage. Chami calls for a paradigmatic shift that recognizes the potential for Central and Southern Africans to have developed centers of civilization and engaged in various enterprises, challenging the prevailing narrative of a violent, disruptive Bantu invasion. Chami concludes by commending Ehret for prompting critical reassessment of the traditional narrative of Bantu expansions, but emphasizes the need for a more comprehensive approach that incorporates archaeological, linguistic, and historical evidence. He suggests that by integrating diverse sources of data and adopting a more nuanced understanding of African societies, scholars can achieve a more accurate and holistic interpretation of history. According to the African Union Factbook, another important stream of the emigration form, ancient Egypt came down southwards through the Congo forest. From the Congo forest, some went westwards to occupy the near west coast of Africa. Others more migrated from the Congo forest, precisely around the general area of present-day Cameroon and Gabon, to occupy East Africa and what is today the SADC countries. This was the branch from ancient Egypt that European historians call the Bantus, of the now famous Bantu migration, which took place between Chibon 1000 BC to 1500 AD. But originally, they were from the stock of ancient Egypt and Nubia, who migrated to avoid the foreign invaders, who attacked their homelands in the Nile Valley. Research by Dr. Kewang et al. Reveals that the southern-bound migration streams into the continent could have been rooted in ancient Kush. The retrieval of ancient DNA, aDNA, from a 4,000-year-old hair sample in Sudan reveals genetic relatedness of the Kerma period individual from Sudan with early pastoral groups in Eastern Africa suggests a possible genetic source population for Eastern African pastoralists, highlighting the rapid southward dispersal of pastoralists from the Middle Nile Valley. The study emphasizes the need for additional aDNA from ancient northeastern African populations and underscores the value of preserved ancient hair as a source of aDNA for future research, particularly where typical aDNA archives are unavailable or poorly preserved. Dr. S. Luanga adds further context to this in affirming that the expansion of these purported Bantus did not assume the dimensions of an exodus from one area to another. It was most probably a movement of small numbers of people from one village to the next, and sometimes back again, a process that was repeated over and over again until successive generations reached all parts of sub-equatorial Africa, perhaps over the space of 1,000 or more years. It should not be imagined that the Bantu migrations took the form of a linear progression, unidirectional, in a perpetual forward movement. On the contrary, over thousands of years, movements must have occurred in all directions. According to Manfred Ehret, since 1977, archaeological fieldwork in the Central African rainforest, spanning regions of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Cameroon, has revealed the presence of pottery-producing groups around 800 BC. Early ceramics, dating between 400 and 300 BC, are dispersed across central Cameroon and the inner Congo basin, although site density is inconsistent. Common formal and decorative elements in the pottery suggest potential relationships between the groups that created them, leading to discussions on historical connections. Attempts to correlate Bantu language dispersal with archaeological evidence in the region have faced challenges due to the lack of direct association between languages and material culture. While migrations typically leave material traces, the current archaeological record in the rainforest lacks sufficient interconnectedness to support claims of a steady influx of Bantu speakers. In summary, there is no archaeological evidence for a mass Bantu migration. Archaeological data, including radiocarbon dating, offer insights into the past, but are subject to limitations when linking with linguistic and genetic fields. Despite the challenges, understanding the basis and constraints of chronologies in various disciplines is crucial for interdisciplinary research. Ehret continues on, in affirming that research on Bantu-speaking populations in molecular genetics has grown significantly, aiming to contribute to understanding the dispersal of Bantu languages. Despite this, studies correlating genetic variation with cultural and linguistic diversity in Africa remain insufficiently explored. While geneticists aim to shed light on historical puzzles, they sometimes overestimate the historical potential of their field. Brigitte Packendorf's work emphasizes the co-evolution of genes and languages, highlighting the impact of social interaction and contact-induced language change. Challenges arise in correlating genetic data with a linguistic patterning and language change, as there are no genes specifically for language. Furthermore, genetic studies in Bantu Africa remain limited, particularly in central, southwestern, and southern regions, impacting the potential for comparison with linguistic and archaeological datasets. Interdisciplinary collaboration is crucial, yet there's a tendency for each discipline to seek support from others' conclusions, leading to potential circular reasoning. Molecular genetics, historical linguistics, and archaeology have shown intensive cooperation in recent years. Yet archaeology's potential to provide authentic historical evidence is often overlooked. The origins of Bantu languages are believed to stem from northwestern Central Africa, with their speakers likely migrating through the equatorial rainforest on their way south. However, despite the dominance of Bantu languages in the forest, there's a lack of material evidence to support population movements, hindering connections between linguistics, genetics, and archaeology. Without ancient DNA, both genetics and historical linguistics struggle to establish arguments based on authentic evidence. The integration of molecular, linguistic, and archaeological data into a cohesive historical narrative remains elusive, as correlations between these fields are still underdeveloped. The gap between Bantu linguistics' inherent presence and archaeological evidence remains unbridged, as does the disparity between molecular datasets and the linguistic record. Moreover, contemporary molecular data has yet to be linked convincingly to documented human history. This dilemma echoes the philosophical concept of the Munchausen trilemma, where the demand for proof leads to logical challenges or an arbitrary suspension of reason. Despite efforts, historical Bantu linguistics and archaeology haven't provided conclusive solutions to the Bantu problem, and the impact of molecular genetics hasn't significantly altered the overall understanding. While issues of scale play a role, the addition of molecular genetics introduces another layer of complexity, contributing to what can now be described as a trilemma in understanding the Bantu expansion. Felix Chami provides further clarity by placing Africans historically classified as Bantu within the context of Punt or Puanit. According to his analysis, classical maps often defined ancient Punt. Now turning to the land of Punt, it is well documented that Papio hamidras, Papio anubis, and Papio cynocephalus are species native to sub-Saharan Africa. Remains of these species have been discovered within the Pharaonic civilization, or they are depicted in amulets, as with Papio cynocephalus. All these animals originated from the south, towards the land referred to as Punt or Pwani by the ancient Remenkemi. Dr. Felix Chami argues that a long-standing colonial legacy has confined the boundaries of Punt to northeast Africa. However, several pieces of evidence support a broader extension of Punt into the Swahili coast, the Great Lakes region, and southern Africa. A comparative analysis of toponyms like Rapta and Azania, found in classical Greek and Roman sources replacing Punt and Panchaea, supports this argument. Many scholars have situated Rapta, the capital of Azania, in the Rufiji River area along the central coast of Tanzania. Additionally, there is evidence of Romans such as Theophilus and Dioscorus visiting the Mozambique Channel during their travels to Azania. When the Roman skipper Diogenes journeyed to Azania, he explored the Great Lakes region and witnessed a mountain he termed the Mountain of the Moon, which is now known as the Ruwenzori Mountain, and identified the River Kagera as the source of the Happy River, which provides water to Lake Ukerewe. Moreover, there are Siderolithic or Iron Age commonalities in Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa, connected to the Savannah Pastoral Neolithic and Denderit culture. Similarities in coinage and Kweli pottery further support this notion within the same geographic zone. Evidence suggests that early Iron Age peoples along the coast of Zanzibar were involved in sailing and international trade. Maps depicting the spread of Punt culture south align with data from the archaeologist and historian Dika Akwa on the Pautaponda diaspora in Central and Southern Africa. With the application of the proper methods in historical linguistics and archaeology, Dika Akwa's model can clarify many of the questions that the flawed Bantu model cannot answer. This is primarily because we have classical attestations for Punt and no examples of any orature in contemporary Africa that refers to people as Bantu. With the usage of ancient Metrem and Kime as a reciprocal reference system, we can these questions linguistically and understand the cultural origins of the modern populations defined as Bantu. Based on these findings, Dr. Felix Chami concludes that the geographical extent of Punt, later referred to as Azania by the Romans, encompassed what is now Eritrea and Somalia, extending down to the Swahili coast, the Great Lakes region, and southern Africa. The penetration of Islam marks the end of the hegemony of the Ngala or Zagawa, initiating the third cycle, which ends in the 18th century. In the 12th century, from Senegal to the Nile, 7 empires emerge, replacing the single empire of Wangara and the marginalized Tekro. The Ngalam is significantly reduced in the region of Upper Senegal and Falaime. To the extreme west, Jolof arises, 12th-18th centuries, and to its north, Tekro continues its existence under various names, Makraza, Fouta Toro, etc. To the east, the Malinke. Brothers of the Ngalambo, who founded Jolof, displaced the masters of Soso, 12th to 13th centuries, and seek to unify Ankara and Ouagadougou under the name of Mali. From the Malinke, branches emerged that established the Mossi Empire with 3 partners, Yatenga, Mamprusi, Dagomba. Further west, with the central Zagara or Wangara having fragmented, the Islamized Sow, called Benisef, established the Kanem-Bornu Empire, 12th-18th century. While fugitives from pre-Mali associate with pre-established populations in Damgara to build the vast state confederation of Wangarawa, or the future Hausa. In the 13th century, the Mandara kingdom is born east of Wangarawa. The So or So, settled on the lower Yo, and in Ngala country, constitute the outpost of the Arbasa, or Second Biafra Empire, further south. At its peak, their hegemony allows them to assimilate newcomers and give rise to the Kotoko people, who separate from Arbasa a century later. In the same region, around Lake Chad, the Kanembu, born in contact with the Sao and the Kisara peoples, migrate powerfully, widely radiating south and west of Chad to the Mandara Range. When they and their Mbof and Jukun brothers seek the route of the Benue River and the Adamawa Massif, they trigger the resurgence of the Kisara movement initiated since the 7th century, but long hindered by central Wangara, then by Kanem-Bornu. The remnants of the peoples concentrated around the southern shores of Lake Chad organized their defense by creating sometimes small, highly structured states. These include the Ngala of the north, Vala, Galabdes, Ngara, Gamhwa, then the Gamego, or Molgoa, and on the other side, the Kotoko, Massa, Musgum. The Mandara kingdom thus arises contemporaneously with the Gangara kingdom, another heir of Wangara in Hausa or Wangarawa country, and the Bulala kingdom of Gauga or Fitri. East of the Kanem-Bornu Empire and the Bulala kingdom, many Zagawa revived the Taghara or Eastern Wangara Empire. This, considerably reduced but firmly resisting Islam, is better known as Tajura, a corruption of the term Tagara. South of Wangarawa and north of the Yoruba and Benin worlds, the Atagara Empire was to be established around the city of Ida. Southeast of Arbasa or Second Biafra, covering the Adamawa Plateau and the banks of the Benue River, the Ngala, coming from Senegal, Pre-Mali, and Chadian Ngala. Through the Ambu movement reached the Uil and Obongi valleys by the end of the 11th century. From the 12th to the 15th century, they founded the double empire of Galasimo, soon shaken by the breakup of Arbasa, or Second Biafra, and the passage of the new wave of Bantu peoples from the north at the mouth of the Congo River, where the Teoteke, or Makoko Empire, and the powerful Mani Congo were forged since the 12th century. Galashimo collapsed. In the 16th century, a conquering king, Mbedi, son of Mbongo, founded the maritime and commercial Ambu Empire around the Bay of Biafra. Upon his death, his sons continued the Holy Njanga revolution he ignited. Another group of his sons heads towards the region of the Great Lakes, where they are found among the Abaluya and Haya as the Abagala group. Another group, known as Imbangala, invaded the Congo Empire. They are better known as Jagas. This group is responsible for the establishment of the small but powerful states of Yaka, Humbe, and Obimbundu. Additionally, Ilunga Mbili, who married Bulanda, Kongolo's sister, to give birth to Kalala Ilunga, the first king of Luba Kalala, is also from these Imbangala or Jaga, while his grandson, Walefu or Liu, founds the Luba Empire dynasty. Saibinda Ilunga, his brother, marries Queen Luigi and founds the Lunda Empire dynasty. Then a cross between the Lunda and Roswi aristocracies is said to have given rise to the Barotse or Lozi dynasty of the Zambezi. Must the Imbangala necessarily be assimilated to a last branch of the Bangala delayed to the east of the Adamawa Plateau by the pressure of the Mbum? The hypothesis is worth considering. It seems to us that everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, the 16th century was the era of Nala hegemony. Jean Vansina, an ethno-historian, also wonders where these Jaga, who so abruptly altered the course of Central African history and caused the Congolese disaster in 1561 and 1576, came from. They came from Lion Mountain, which we have already identified as the erupting volcano of Cameroon, and were retreating southeastward in the Ndongo region towards Angola and Bengal. J. Vansina can then write, their true name was Imbangala or Imbangola. The collection of a series of traditions increasingly highlights the multi-headed Kosum Empire of Ngalanjam, 16th until 18th centuries, which consisted of three main groups of swarms of colonies, namely the Ngala derived from Galasimo in the north, the Abagala towards the Great Lakes region, and the Imbangala to the south. Each group organized on the basis of brotherhood chains, Hanseatic leagues, military fronts, mints, political centers of the Sons of the Leopard, congregation of the Priests of the Panther, refer to some holy cities where the brotherhood of water genies is alive. Jengu, Bulungu, Orungu, Mevungu, Kumungu, holding sacred knowledge and perpetual universal sovereignty. The set, either inter-empires or states or confederations with very close relations, is then distributed, according to regions, into empires, federations of chieftaincies, etc. It seems, therefore, that Ngalanjam can be reduced to the following divisions and subdivisions. The southern Ngala, on the other hand, belonged to the second migratory wave that departed from the west towards the east to the Adamawa Massif. Upon reaching Central Africa, and even Southeast Africa, these Ngala, detached from the Sinigala of Ngalam and associated with elements of the northern Ngala, gave rise here and there to the Bangala people of Zaire and the Central African Republic, the Ngangala of Congo, the Galoa Miene of Gabon, and probably the Igala of central Nigeria. Established in the Bay of Biafra at the gateway to the port of Douala, the core of the Ngala then divides into four branches. The Ngala Douala of the Cameroonian, Gabonese, and Nigerian coasts. The Ngombe, who joined their Bangala, Bakundo, and Mongo cousins from Zaire at the dawn of the 17th century. The Abagala and Iswangalo from the Great Lakes area. and the Imbangala from southern Zaire, Angola, and the Zambezi. At first glance, it's worth noting that despite the long distances separating these four branches, their respective traditions agree on their Egyptian origin. Ngala, Mongo Kundu, Ngombe from Zaire and Central Africa. Let's see what is discussed among the Bangala or Ngala, Mongo Kundu, and Ngombe. In their famous book, Westermann and Baumann note the following. It is certain that the matrilineal planters once extended much further north, up to Cameroon and the Middle Congo, and were pushed southwards by the north-south migration of Bantu tribes from the north. These tribes came from southern Sudan and are represented today notably by the Ngala Yanzi, the Mongo Kundus, and the Ngombe. This push also affected the Mpongwe of Gabon. The entire group displaced from the Ubangi Valley includes the Mangbetu, with the Baya, Mangbele, Kere, Lebe, Popye, and Manje. The Rumbi group separated from them, with the Bali coming from the west towards the east. The Nala Yanzi are relatives of the Nala Pande, who, through successive leaps, settled further east. According to Westermann and Baumann, the Nala have been heavily influenced by the Congolese peoples proper, from the Ubangi-Uele basin of the Upper Congo and the loop of this river. Providing more details about the movements of the various branches in this region, probably around the 12th century, the same authors specify that it is necessary to mention first the Yanzi and Bangui between the mouths of the Kasai and the Ubangi, probably pushed by the Mbawakas from the South Sudan. They left the right bank of the bend of the Ubangi with their relatives, the Furu, Loi, Ngiri, Lobalo, Ngala, Boloki, and Poto. The Yansi and Bangi followed the right bank of the Ubangi and occupied all the lands along the Alima, Sangha, Likula, and Middle Congo rivers. A group of Bangi returning northward constituted, between the Sangha and the Lobaje, the people of the Pandes. The Mongo Kundo group is related to the Ngala. According to Pisces Besta, who associates them with the Bosaka or even the Boyela, it is necessary to distinguish the Ngombe from the Mongo Kundo. He sees in the Ngombe a more recent element and connects them to the Ngala. The difference lies in the fact that the Mongo Kundo allowed themselves to intermix with the Ikalemba from Lake Leopold Setu. With invasions from the north, the Mongo Kundo were mixed with various elements of the invaders. It should be clarified that while the Mongo Kundo and the Nala settled on the banks of the Congo River from the 11th century, the Nombe indeed represent a more recent element. Belonging to the Nala from the Gabon-Cameroon coast, they only separated from this western group at the dawn of the 17th century to join the Bangala or Ngala of Zaire. In any case, the Mongo Kundu of Zaire are close cousins of the Ngala. It would be more accurate to say that they derive from the latter, like the Yanzi, Bangi, and Pande. Like the other Ngala, their origin from the northeast of Africa is immediately apparent. Pisces Besa notes it in these terms. If we did not know it from their traditions, which all refer to the north, beyond the Great Water, we would perceive it from their civilization, which often strikingly recalls the savanna regions of the north and northwest of the Ubangi. The Mongo Kundus artifacts selected by Sherbesa reflect successively Egypt, Kordofan, and among the Margi of northern Cameroon, which is not surprising. The Mongo Kundu of Zaire consider themselves a branch of these Ngala, who, after leaving Egypt through Ethiopia and Kordofan, directly reached the Lake Chad basin around the present location of the Margi. From there, they moved to the Congolese region with the Nala branches, whose migration had first reached the banks of the Senegal, before the push towards Lake Chad. Ngala of the Atlantic coast, the Ngale peoples along the Congo River have some eastern relatives, the Ngala Pande. To the west, along the Atlantic coast from Gabon to southeastern Nigeria through Cameroon, the family of peoples grouping Ngala, Ngangala, and Galoa Miene also seems to have connections with the former. This might also be the case for the Igala living among the Yoruba of central Nigeria. For now, we will focus on tracing the migration of Ngala from Lower Cameroon, commonly referred to as Douala, in the broad sense. In this regard, Dr. Putren believes that a first migration called Ambu, which set out towards the 11th century to reach Congo on one hand and Cameroon on the other, would include at least the Douala. In 1949, Madame Idugas resumed Putren's thesis, recalling that the latter had examined the data collected by Avalode in 1905. Like her predecessors, she confirms that the Ngala Douala belonged to the groups of populations who, coming from the north, constitute the Ambu. Among the peoples of this invasion, she includes the Dakota mentioned in Douala tradition. She then specifies that the Ambu invasion reached Central Africa in the 12th century. Where did the Ambu invasion come from? Yois, Dugast, unaware of the traditions of memory professionals, cannot say anything about it. Baumann, in his repeatedly cited work, establishes that the Ngala Douala detached from their Ngala Pandey brothers. He writes, Struck has demonstrated that tribes related to the Ngala of the Middle Congo were once spread as far as Douala on the coast of Cameroon. For him, the Ngala who reached Central Africa represent the transition to the people of the Congo, properly speaking from the Ubangi-Wele Bassin, the Upper Congo, and the loop of the river. We have seen that this group is linguistically linked to the Bantu people of the Cameroonian coast, which is quite surprising. It is possible that the separation is due to the migrations of the Fang. After the Central African stage, the Cameroonian Ngala moved to Congo. There, among the Bakongo, a core called Gangala, Bahangala, Ngangala, Bangangala, etc. is also found. We now know the main lines of their trajectory. Leaving the Bangala, they married Bakongo women, unable to wrest power from the Bakongo in the nascent Congo Empire. They moved to East Gabon. There they left the Bakota, their Kaka companions, before reaching the Bay of Biafra. There are similarities between the Douala, the Lingala, the Bakota, or even the Kikongo, notes Father Engelbert Mveng. Note that the Lingala mentioned here refers to the Congolese water people as a whole. Gombe, Bahandi, Babinza, Kundu, Pande, Yanzi, Mongo, and others, whom the Ngala Douala recognize as their brothers. Although some European ethnologists insist that there is no Bangala people in Zaire. In fact, more Congolese than the Ngala Douala. The Bangala of Zaire that we have already mentioned are located in the equator region of Zaire, spreading their language, Lingala, and simultaneously their trade in a vast area. It is the Ngala Douala, overflowing the Atlantic coast of Cameroon, Gabon, Nigeria, and Equatorial Guinea, to which the Bombongo are linked as the main core known as Kalbongo, by the European navigators of the 16th century who call them Achalinces Aethiopes, the most important nation of the Western Aethiopoids. The Ngala Douala people experienced segmentation that allowed them to generate other peoples. The research connecting Central and Southern Africa to the classical Happy River Basin is proving to be a highly fruitful area of study. Evidence such as the EM35 subclade EFT 321625, found in the first dynasty of ancient Kemet, and the presence of EY161140, subclade in Cameroon, validate a migration from Kemet to West and Central Africa. Additionally, the presence of EM2 haplogroup subclades, such as EM4, 269 and U29 Tai from pre-dynastic Kemet, among the Bamileke of Western Cameroon supports Dr. Dieudonné Toukam's archaeogenetic analysis of the Baladis origin of the Bamileke. Autosomal and phylogenetic analysis of Central African populations by Dr. Nancy Bird et al. reveals an ancient Kemetic component among the grass fields people of Western Cameroon. Genome-wide autosomal analysis of Cameroonian populations further validates the Central African Mbedi narratives, affirming a Sudanic origin of Ngalanjam peoples in Central and Southern Africa. The presence of EM2 haplogroup subclades such as EY27258, EY369800, EFT43 and EY369824 from pre-dynastic Kemte among the Nguni peoples of southern Africa suggests a classical Hopi River Valley origin of the Nguni lineage, while the presence of EM2 and EM35 haplogroup subclades such as EM293, EPF6748, ECTS11328, and EY25272 among the Swahili people aligns with Dr. Felix Chami's analysis of the classical Hopi River Valley roots of Swahili civilization. Moreover, according to Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, Mimfon Ibrahim Joya, and the Bamum of Cameroon retained core elements of the pharaonic civilization into the late 19th and early 20th century, further solidifying the connection between Central and Southern Africa and the classical Hopi River Valley. In conclusion, discarding the terms with a racist colonial and pseudo-scientific legacy, such as Bantu, in favor of utilizing terms from living languages like Ngala and Ngalanjam to connect the peoples of Central and Southern Africa to their true roots in the classical Hopi River Valley Basin, particularly with ancient Kemet and Kush, represents a pivotal step in historical and cultural accuracy. This approach builds on the Diopian migration model, which emphasizes the deep historical connections between Africa's diverse populations and highlights the importance of reclaiming indigenous languages and narratives. By embracing terms rooted in living languages, such as Ngala and Ngalanjam, we honor the rich heritage and linguistic diversity of African peoples while also acknowledging their shared ancestral origins in the classical Hopi River Valley Basin. This paradigm shift not only fosters a more authentic understanding of African history, but also empowers communities to reclaim their narratives and forge stronger connections to their ancestral lands. Ultimately, adopting this approach facilitates a more holistic and inclusive portrayal of Africa's past, present, and future, grounded in the lived experiences and cultural identities of its diverse populations.